Okay, Howard, here we go there we go. I think I have that centered just about right. On Chapter 7, up until this point, our class has been studying American history, starting back with the colonies, how slavery came to be in the United States. We progressed up through the 1700s to come to the American Revolution, and that was at the end of Chapter 6. And so this is now our country post-Revolutionary War and how we came to have the government that we have. So before the Revolutionary War was even over, there had been several people who recognized the need that the colonies were going to have to be unified. Up through this time, each colony had enjoyed its own autonomous government. They all had their own elected legislatures, and depending on the charter which established that colony, you had your governors of those colonies. Nobody really thought of themselves as a collective whole. They were very local minded. If you came from the colony of South Carolina, that was part of your identity, but you weren't thinking of yourself as, I'm from the colonies, talking about the 13, just talking about, they were regionally connected. And so you had, obviously, disputes between the southern colonies, the middle colonies, and the New England colonies. We'll talk about a little bit more of that, especially after we get beyond this chapter, because these regional differences are going to play into eventually the Civil War. But up to this point, you have to remember that what led us into the American Revolution, assuming that you know some things about the American Revolution, was the way in which Parliament of Great Britain dealt with us. We were loyal English subjects. We were proud to be English subjects. We weren't looking to separate from them. But when England decided that they needed to control us more strictly, when they needed to tax us more stringently, that's when the colonists took exception to what Parliament was doing. As a way of going back, when these colonies were started, the king would sign a paper called a charter, and he would bequeath land that really he had no right bequeathing, but that's how things were done back then. During the time of the explorers, you could have a Portuguese explorer, an Italian explorer, and an English explorer all stand within 100 miles of each other, and they would make these bold proclamations. We claim this land for, the Spanish queen and king, or we claim this land for the Portuguese queen or king, or the English queen at the time. And they, having no idea that 100 miles south of them or 100 miles north, there was one other explorer who was claiming the same land that they were claiming and giving it to someone else. And then the other party that they weren't taking into consideration was that there were Indians or natives to this land already living on the land, and they thought the land was theirs. And if possession is 9/10 of the law, it belonged to the natives, and we took it from them, and we took it from them wrongly. So, from the time that the colonies were started, Great Britain had very little to do with the colonies. They did not try to micromanage the colonies. They did not establish unified governments in all the colonies. How the colonists were governed they determined. The colonists themselves determined how they would be governed. They chose their leaders, and it had worked for over 100 years, and life was great. And then after the French and Indian War, Great Britain was like, oh, we have these colonies over in North America, and you know what? We should watch over them a whole lot better, and it went from downhill from there. You might understand this, Howard, as in when all of a sudden your parents decide that they want to look at your phone. They've never looked at your phone before, they've never gotten into what you have on your phone, but now all of a sudden they want to look at your phone. And, you don't like it because, well, that was your privacy, or, you felt like this was your place and they had no say on what happened with your phone. That is how the colonists perceived the interference of Parliament. Now, of course, they did not want to break, but when Parliament decided to tax them heavily and to affect how colonists could make their money, they could change their goods or sell their goods to other places, and it came down to money. Then they would then they took exception. So now that we're out of the Revolutionary War, the colonists are not excited to give power to a unified federal government. They are actually thinking that they just dodged a bullet and that they want to keep 13 individual colonies separate from each other. The problem with that is that they were small. They didn't have any great sweeping armies, and so if you had any of the other large countries at the time, France, who had just helped us in the Revolutionary War, would eventually turn her eye and once again try to regain land in North America. Spain, any one of these countries could have turned their eyes back to North America and said, hey, it's free game. They will never be able to defeat our armies. Let's go after them. So back during the French and Indian War, Ben Franklin had authored a plan called the Albany Plan of Union, and he had tried to offer the idea of unifying at that time. But nobody was keen about having another unified government like Parliament or the king over them, and so it was rejected. Well, capital letter A, looking at your notes, adoption of the Articles of Confederation. Here in Delaware, we have a founding father by the name of John Dickinson, and he was responsible for authoring the Articles of Confederation in 1777. Now, the war is not over. The war is not going to be over for another 4 years. And but even then, he saw the need for this unification. As I said before, everyone was very loyal to their state government. They did not see the need for a federal government, little letter B. And C, smaller states like Delaware and New Jersey, Rhode Island, they feared the power the larger states like Virginia and New York would have over them. So they were not keen to unify. It took 4 years to pass the Articles. We use a word called, when we're dealing with the Constitution, and it's called ratify. And that means to approve. And in order to have the states unified, they all had to ratify the Articles of Confederation. I'm going to pause this for just 1 second. I will be right back. Okay, so I'm back. In order for the colonies to agree to this, there had to be a compromise. And the problem was that they were really not willing to sacrifice any important powers to a unified federal government. They really wanted to maintain their own control and only give the Continental Congress very limited powers and the ability to do things. And while it's in place, the Continental Congress does have some successes, but for the most part, they really did not give it the ability to take off. One of the things that made coming together unified was it gave the Continental Congress control over the western lands we got through the Treaty of Paris. And they figured that if they gave the Continental Congress control over these lands, nothing was established there, no governments, no colonies. They could do with it as they wanted. And they figured that it would be these lands that would bear the financial burden of supporting the Continental Congress. First, by giving them the control, they could sell the land. And then whoever moved into the land, the Continental Congress could then determine how they would tax them. All right, I'm going to move on down. Each state was given one vote in the Continental Congress, which that allayed the fears of the smaller states over the larger states. If everybody had equal representation, they felt like they were going to be represented well. So the articles do get passed. They're ratified on March 1st of 1781, and they are put into place. And here are the capital letter B outlines for you the political powers that were given to the Congress under the Articles. First off, it only allowed for a Congress. It didn't allow for a president. It didn't allow for a Supreme Court. It just allowed for a legislative body. The powers had the Congress had the power to raise and maintain an army. They could declare war, and they could make treaties with foreign powers, but guess what they couldn't do? They couldn't tax. Well, if you can't tax, you can't make money. And if you can't make money, how do you raise and pay for an army? One of the problems that, the Revolutionary colonial army had was the fact that their supplies were limited. And their uniforms were falling off of them. And, the British and the Indians were stealing their supply lines, and things were getting broken, and our soldiers were in really, really poor condition. And the money that the colonies were supposed to send to maintain the Continental Army was not reliable. So, but obviously, they didn't learn from history, and they did not allow the Congress to have power to tax, and therefore they had nothing in order to raise or maintain the army. If they can't have an army, then they can't declare war. And if they don't have money in order to do exports and imports, then it really makes having the power to make treaties with these foreign powers, null and void. What are we offering them? Because our federal government had nothing. And it gave them the right to establish or manage Indian affairs. They could open a postal service, which again, they could charge for the stamps, and they could charge for the use of the postal service, but again, it was not going to be enough to maintain a government. And they even gave them the right to borrow and coin money. Well, you know that people can take dollar bills and put it on a copier, and they can make themselves a whole lot of dollar bills. But there's a lot more to having money, paper money, than just having the actual paper. There has to be something that backs it. And so the problem that the colonies ran into with little letter G, the borrowing and coining of money, is at the time of this Confederation, you had not only each colony printed its own money, and they coined their own money, and each colony dealt in their own monetary system. So, if you tried to buy land in Maryland with Pennsylvania money, the seller in Maryland might demand more and say, oh, Pennsylvania money is not worth as much as Maryland money is. And so it made for a very broken and disjointed economic system. And it was just not, again, there was no backing to it. You could print all the money out and give it to a foreign government and say, here, I'm paying my bill, but if the money isn't worth anything, then you might as well just put it in the fire and use it for kindling. Underneath the Articles of Confederation, the state governments did share some powers with the federal government, and like I just said, they both could coin money. Well, if everybody's coining money, but there's no money to back the money, it doesn't do any good. They also had the right to declare war. So I don't know how Virginia would have felt if Massachusetts would have declared war and then said, oh yeah, by the way, I'm obligating you and your men to fight in the war that I just declared. It just it was not a solid system. Going down to little letter C, they could make treaties. So if the federal government says, I'm going to make a treaty, and France says, oh, by the way, I already have a treaty from South Carolina, you have to follow it. Again, a lot of lines of miscommunication was not going to make for solid government, and they could issue lines